Okay, well, I'd like to welcome everybody to the festivities this evening. It's a bit of a poignant kind of evening because this is the last of the series that I'm giving. I do have some other ideas of things to put together, but this will be the last of the official series, these 8 talks that I've given here. They've all been recorded. And this one will be as well. And Cora, with her, despite all her obligations at our shul, will be posting this within the next few days. So you're welcome to go and see it again. This is actually my favorite, and you'll see why, because it has really a big group of different subject matter and covers a lot of ground. And I'm going to be going through this Odyssey. You're going to come on a journey with me that I hope you'll find stimulating, interesting, maybe provocative, and surprising. And I'm going to just tell you that we're going to go off on about 3 different tangents, 2 of which we're just going to go on temporarily and then come back. The last one is the aha moment that's going to go off on another tangent and not come back. So you can just stay, and at those points when we're going to sort of change tack a little bit, I'm going to ask Cora to unmute so that we can, or you'll be able to unmute yourselves, because I'd like to throw out some options for people to try and answer the mysteries that I'm going to present to you. But I hope you enjoy this journey. And as we do in any scientific presentation, I have no financial interest or conflict of interest, but just a very strong biblical, historical, Talmudic, et cetera, interest, as you'll see here. So these are the topics of the presentations that I've given, starting in the summer during this epidemic, which has forced us to put things online, but it's been fun to be able to redo most of these. Some were in the sessions that we did at Beth David a year ago. But some are new. And these are the 8. The one on the hidden messages at the bottom, again, was done in 2 parts. And if you are interested in accessing any of the other 7 talks, just to let you know, and I'm going to repeat this later on in case some people come in late, you have to go onto the YouTube site and type in the search for Beth David, B'nai Israel, Beth Am. And when you get there, you'll see the first icon says something like 102 videos. K'nai Nahora, there may be actually more now. I think it may be 103. But when you click on that, you will see when you get into the site at the top, there are some words, and one of them is playlists. And if you press playlists, Cora has put all my talks into one folder. And so you will find them there. And the same with this one. When we're done today, the recording will be posted up on that site. So B'nai Israel, Beth David, Beth Am on YouTube. Click the first icon you come to, and then playlists at the top will have all of my talks there. And you'll have a nice 8 hours of hopefully stimulation. The first 4 talks were the ones I put in blue here, and they are different talks on dating the narratives in the early part of the Torah. These were ones that, again, I presented before, and you can find all of them. And in the first few, in those 4 presentations, we actually found this timeline from the creation of the universe through to when and where the Garden of Eden existed, when and where Noah's flood occurred, probably, dating the matriarch and patriarch age and the time of the Exodus from Egypt. And I'm going to cite this one, the creation of the universe, as one that we came to through various sources in this presentation. And you're going to see a couple of things I'm presenting today are derived and related to a couple of the things that I presented there. So we dealt with Ma'aseh Bereshit, the creation story, and how the science matches the narrative from there, and how it's connected to Purim and Passover. So all of that is in. We looked at the Ma'aseh Bereshit from 4 different aspects. And in that presentation, I dealt with 4 topics, and these are the ones, if those of you who were with me either live back a year ago or have seen the presentation online here. There were 4 topics. The first was the Kabbalistic paradigm of creation, the physics behind the creation story, again, the parallels between Megillat Esther and Passover and Maseh Bereshit and the Genesis codes. But today I'm going to introduce something different that I did not cover then. And if you remember back to that presentation, I said that there are many other ways of looking at the Genesis creation story. Of course, there's many, many, many layers to it. One of them is one that you may never have actually had presented, but one that was brought to my attention many, many years ago. It's called the cadence of creation. And you'll see what I mean by that in a little while. So today we're going to do the final talk. And they say in Hebrew, acharon acharon chaviv, which means that when you have a number of people, different age groups, or in a family, or a number of subjects, the last one is one that sometimes is special, or one that you have to give special attention to because they're the youngest or the most inexperienced. And this is my chaviv, and I hope that you'll enjoy it. Here are the references, and I'm going to show you the different books that I've used. You'll be able to get access to these when these are up. One is a book by Baumol and Hancock called Talisman. Another book that you'll find interesting, I'm going to allude to later on, is The Secrets of the Sistine Chapel, which I'll allude to a little later on. And the core of what I'm going to talk about is from a book that I got at the Jewish Book Fair about 25 years ago called The Secret Doctrine of the Kabbalah by a professor. It's called Recovering the Key to Hebraic Sacred Science by a professor by the name of Leonora Leith. And that's the first reference that I have here. But there are other references, and they're all ones that you can find later. As I presented to you in each of these talks, we say this is how science meets the Bible. And these are the various areas of science that we have utilized in part, not all of them at any one time, but these are the ones that we have used in selection to understand some of the work that I presented to you over these talks. And those of you that may have been at my live talk about a year ago, which was the last of that series a year ago, may have already seen the core of this presentation, but I have updated it. And of course, one of the things I have to update every year is the year. It's now an Odyssey of 5781. When you heard it last year, if you were there, it was 5780. And the first time I presented this was actually about 15 years ago, but this presentation has now been refined and updated. And you'll see at the bottom, periodically through the presentation, I'm going to give you this timeline. Now, you're going to say that I talked about the age of the universe as being 13.8 billion years from one of the talks already. Well, let's put that aside and just go with the Hebrew year for now. And we're going to just talk about the framework in terms of the Hebrew years from 5781. And as you know, the year is Tafshin Pei Aleph, but it's actually Hey apostrophe Tafshin Pei Aleph. If you remember my hidden meanings talk, there's actually a 5 because that's the millennium. And some people, as we mentioned, actually use it as the 6th millennium and use the Vav, Tafshin Pei Aleph. But we're just going to go use Tafshin Pei Aleph, the conventional year, which is now 2021. So here we start now. Here we start our journey. When Moses was up on Mount Sinai, we know that he received the written laws. And that's what that's the pshat. They received the 10 commandments and the written laws. But at the same time, our sages mentioned that he received also the oral law, which was passed down from generation to generation, as we read in Pirkei Avot, passed down orally as the oral code to understand the Torah. And this was eventually codified by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi and the sages in the early centuries of the Common Era. But the Kabbalists believe that there was actually a third item that he'd received, which was called a secret wisdom or mysticism, which was thought to originally have been transmitted by the Kohanim. And this is what we call the mysticism and eventually became known as Kabbalah. And it's thought that this was also something that Moshe received on Har Sinai. And I'm going to now present three mysteries to you. First of all, a short one, which is the visions seen in Exodus, in Shmot. The second is terms used in the Shacharit prayers, and what do they mean? And third, a paradox in the story of Gan Eden, of the Garden of Eden. The first mystery is what is meant in two cryptic verses in Shmot, in Exodus. Chapter 25, verse 9, the Hebrew translated says, God is talking to Moses. I am exactly as I show you the pattern of the tabernacle, the Mishkan, and the pattern of all its furnishings, so shall you make it. 31 verses later, note well and follow the patterns for them, these components that are being shown to you on the mountain. And what in Kabbalah, or what some of the commentators, the mystics say, is that there was a very large body of information transmitted to Moshe on Har Sinai. And I guess that makes sense, because if I think back to our wonderful Torah reader, our ritual director, Michael Rubin, when he reads the 10 Commandments, 5 to 7 minutes, it's done, okay? And then if you say that if Moses got the 10 Commandments after 10 minutes, there's nothing much to do. He said, okay, I'll give you the oral law. But that's the Mishnah, not the Gemara. It was just the Mishnah. Might have taken a day or two or three maybe, but he was up there for 40 days. So what else did God have to tell him? You know, how are the wife and kids and so on, who knows? But it's very likely that he got a whole lot more information. And according to some of the mystics, it was actually some of what we were going to talk about today. Terms in the Shacharit prayer. This is the second mystery. In two prayers, the first one is Psukei de Zimra in Yishtabach Shimcha Alad Malkeinu. There's the passage very shortly after that says Ki lecha na'eh oz umemshala netzach gvura gedula tehila tiferet kedusha umalchut. Here in the Hebrew, memshala, netzach, gedula, gvura, tiferet umalchut. These are actually code words, as we'll learn in a minute. In the Torah service, you know, when we're actually raising the Torah and moving the Torah and bringing it off the bima, Lecha Hashem hagedula v'hagevura v'hatiferet v'netzach v'hahod are also the same code words. In Hebrew, hagedula, hagevura, tiferet, netzach, and hod. And later on, Lecha Hashem hamamlacha lechol lerosh. These are all specific words that are mystical attributes of Hashem, as we'll discuss. There's memshala, mamlacha, v'harosh. And here's mystery number 3 that we're going to solve in a little while. In Genesis 2, verse 9, we know that Hashem put 2 trees in the Garden of Eden. The first one was Eitz Chaim, which is specifically said betoch hagan, which is translated by some of the commentators as in the middle of the garden. Later on, God commands Adam and Eve that you shall not eat from the tree of knowledge. That's Eitz Hada'at Tov Vara. And then in chapter 3, God forbids Chava, Eve, from eating from the tree in the middle of the garden, which is not the tree of knowledge, but the tree of life. So do you see the paradox here? The tree of life was placed in the middle of Eden. God forbade any eating from the tree of knowledge, but you can't eat from the one in the middle of Eden, according to the last verse, which is not the tree of knowledge, but the tree of life. So the question is, which tree is actually in the middle of Eden? Is it the tree of life or the tree of knowledge? For the Kabbalists, this was a problem. And they solved it in a very ingenious way, as we'll see in a short time. So here are the 3 mysteries to be solved. So, as I mentioned, we dealt with a number of topics in that talk on Maaseh Bereshit. Today, I'm going to continue on with 2. One that you've seen before, and then the cadence of creation, which you have not seen before. Now, what is this Kabbalistic paradigm of creation? And here we are, the timeline, and you see I just peeked in just at the very beginning here, at the beginning of Jewish time, if you want to call it. And that is 5781 years ago, right there on day one. Now, I have a few of my ophthalmology and optometry colleagues online, so this is the only optics piece of this presentation. It's actually from a source of light, you have a spreading of light in what's called vergence. That's the end of the talk, okay? The end of the ophthalmology and optometry. You have the optics, you have a light source, and on day one, Hashem created Or. Vayomer Elohim Yehi Or, Vayhi Or. He created a great light, and light, of course, from the heavens, and it goes out in a triangular way, and because it's from the heavens, we would put it up here. On day two of Maaseh Bereshit, day two of creation, and again, this is going to look familiar to you, but that God separated the waters above and below. V'yavdel bein hamayim me'al larakia uvein hamayim mitachat larakia vayichein. That's represented by two blue lines. On day three, kavu hamayim el makom echad. The waters came together on earth, but in order for water to come together, it has to have land on either side. In addition, on that day, he created vegetation. Vayishva desha. On day four of creation, Hamaor Hagadol Mimshalat Hayom, Hamaor Hakaton, the moon, Lemimshalat Halayla, Ve'et HaKochavim, V'yitain Otam Birakia, so that has to be up in the upper realm. And on day five, he created the fish in the water, and Ofya Ofeif Mishamayim, all the birds in the sky. On day six, the ultimate creation of life, of animals and human beings. And this is now, on day six, is all summarized according to Kabbalistic geometry by this figure. If I put it all together, some of you have seen this before. If not, this is what you come up with. And in Kabbalistic mysticism, this is the origin of creation, the wisdom of Hashem, putting everything together, represented by this figure. And this figure is familiar to all of you as this. Now, this is what I would call the hexagram of creation. I did not say the Star of David. It's the hexagram of creation, because the Star of David was not the original symbol of Judaism. It appears in several different contexts, in several different religions in history, including Judaism. And in ancient times, it was the menorah that was the main Judaic symbol, not the Magen David. Magen David is a more modern symbol, but in the ancient times, back in the time of the Talmud, the menorah was actually the symbol, as you can see on this door in Tiberias from the 2nd to 3rd century, and this tomb from the 1st century in the Galilee, and you can see that it was the menorah that identified this as a Jewish tomb. So the menorah was the original symbol. The Magen David in early mysticism and philosophy was not at all the Magen David was not the pure Jewish symbol. This is the sacred hexagram of Hinduism. If you look in the middle, you can see that it's a hexagram. In Buddhism, it's actually a temple in Tibet. You can see very clearly, it actually represents the upper and lower, the mind and the body, the yin and the yang. All of these are concepts that are all integrated into the hexagram. This is a Muslim tomb in New Delhi from one of the Mughal emperors. This is the grandfather of Shah Jahan, who built the Taj Mahal. His grandfather, a Mughal Muslim leader, was buried in this tomb, and you can see very clearly that on the tomb, very commonly in Muslim tombs from the Middle Ages, there's hexagrams to ward off evil spirits. And many of you will recognize this. This is the Salisbury Plain in the United Kingdom, where Stonehenge exists. In the middle of Stonehenge is a hexagram on the ground. So it's definitely not a Jewish symbol originally. And I'm going to show you a modern interpretation of a hexagram. This is the original design of Heathrow Airport in 1955. Of course, it's expanded to many, many terminals beyond, but this is the original design, whether by chance or by intention. And that's a more modern symbol of the hexagram, not the Star of David. But of course, it is also, as I've shown you, a representative of Kabbalistic geometry. Now, we're going to take this symbol of creation, and we're going to do a geometric enlargement of this core hexagram. And we're going to enlarge it in two different ways. So I'm not going to give you a lot of esoteric geometry, don't worry. I'm going to just have to tell you two math concepts. One is that you can enlarge a hexagram in what's called a half step, like that. You can also enlarge it in what's called a full step, which is that. So you're actually doing it from an angle in a different array, but you have what are called half step and full step enlargements. And now what I want to introduce to you is what's called the cadence of creation, the rhythm of the creation story in the text that you may never have actually realized until somebody points it out to you. What do I mean by the cadence? The cadence is a musical term. God saw that it was good, Vayar Elohim ki tov. It's repeated several times in the Maaseh Bereshit. It occurs after the first paragraph, after the creation of light. It occurs again after a little more than a full paragraph, and then again after a half paragraph on the second day, on the third day rather. And then on the fourth day, it occurs again after a full paragraph of creation work. Then again after another paragraph of creation work. And then at the end, it says, Ki tov me'od, at the very end of the final act of creation, where he created living beings. And then he rested for a full day. After all that work, Gesundheit, he should have a rest, okay? Or he or she should have a rest. So that's Shabbat. Now I'm going to show you, the sequence of the cadence of creation. 1 day, 1 day, a half day. 1 day, 1 day, 1 day, a half day, and then 1. I'd like you to unmute people now, everybody. Can we unmute them, Cora? Because I'd like people, there's going to be people in the audience that are going to recognize this sequence.
Everybody should be able to unmute themselves. If you have any trouble, just use the raise hand, or I can search through and unmute for you.
I want to keep people awake and engaged here. So what is this cadence? 1, 1, a half, 1, 1, 1, a half, 1.
A scale.
More than that, what type of scale?
Regular.
Diatonic major scale. What do I mean by that? Okay, let's mute everybody again. He's got the answer. That's exactly right. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. That is the cadence of creation. So if you're a musicologist, or you play almost any instrument, if you have from C to C, you see the step, step, a half step, 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 a half step, step back at the next C. That's the C major diatonic scale. If you're doing A major, you've got the sharps here. So you're going to have A, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, a half, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, to the next A, to the half at the end, and you have that same sequence. So the cadence of creation is the diatonic major scale. So now let's enlarge this hexagram. This is the hexagram of creation, the core creation by Hashem. Let us enlarge it now in this cadence of creation with full step or half step enlargements. If you do that to the original core hexagram, you end up with this figure, okay? Now, I've actually given you a little premonition of what's going to happen. There's actually a figure within this figure, which is a core to what we're going to do later on. But this is what this enlargement according to the cadence of creation creates. And now you're going to see some astounding tangents that we're going to go on. So mystery number one was the visions in Exodus, in Shemot. What was presented to Moses up on the mountain? Exactly as I show you the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of all its furnishings. Well, the dimensions of the various components are hidden within this figure. That's the menorah that they built. Remember, not the menorah from Hanukkah with 8 candles and a mashamash. This was the candelabra as it's shown at the Knesset, is the design. The table, again, according to certain dimensions, derived from this enlarged, manipulated hexagram with its cadence and enlargements. All the components of the tabernacle, of the Mishkan, to scale are given in this figure. So, from a Kabbalistic point of view or mystical point of view, they believe that this was part of the pattern, quote unquote, in the verses in Exodus. Now, the other thing is, I'm taking a bit of a tangent now because you're going to see something quite interesting. If you do this you can take a hexagram and create a 3-dimensional figure as well. And it's called a hexagroid or something, there's a name for it. But if you have a hexagram enlarged, but in 3 dimensions, it looks a bit like this in a 2-dimensional array. But if you enlarge a 3-dimensional hexagram cubic sort of figure in the cadence of creation, you end up with this. And before you dive off and leave the presentation, give me a second, because you're going to be astounded by what this actually represents. If you look at this very carefully, it's got all these funny glips and bloops and letters and stuff. But you're going to be astounded as to what this creates. This hexagram 3D figure, enlarged by the cadence of creation, gives you the standard model of elementary physics, which is the structure of the atom with quarks, leptons. These are all the subunits of the atom. So you've learned about protons and neutrons and electrons. We learned that back 50 years ago in high school. That was the simple part of atomic work, because over the last 50 years, they found all these little particles within the atom that are subunits of all of these things. And there was one called the Higgs boson, predicted by this model, that the physicists could never find. And this is the Higgs boson. This is the ways that these are all interacted. This Higgs item was never found until they built the reactors, you know, those accelerators that have been built in Europe to accelerate particles to unbelievable speeds. And in 2016, finally, somebody identified in that array, they figured out and they found this missing boson, this Higgs boson, which is the key to unlocking atomic theory. This 3D hexagram in 3 dimensions, enlarged by the cadence of creation, identifies all 12 subparticles, including this Higgs boson, which was not identified until 3,500 years later. It's the structure of the atom as we know today. Now back to our 2D. Okay, I'm coming to tangent. We're coming back now. We're coming back to the core. We're now getting to 1300 BCE, because that's when we think the Exodus occurred. The evidence for that is in one of my other talks. But actually, that we think that that's when it was identified, and when Moshe received the Torah Sinai and the oral law, we thought this was actually one of the things that was presented to him in those 40 days and 40 nights that he was up on Mount Sinai. So here we are, 1300 BCE. And I mentioned that within this complex figure, enlarged from the core, now here again, in the middle is that hexagram, the original one. And you can actually see that there are representations of this enlarged hexagram in various sites. This is a jeweler in Las Vegas. And when I was there many, many years ago, I found this in the window. You can see it's an enlarged hexagram. And here on our trip to Israel with Beth David a couple of years ago, we were passing by a shul, and this is on the wall of the outside wall of the shul. Look at that. You see what they have. The first two enlargements of the hexagram according to the cadence of creation. Now I want to deal with this figure within a figure, which is within this complex 2D array. This figure will be recognized if you are a Kabbalist or if you know basic Kabbalah, because it's this figure. And this figure is very famous in Kabbalistic literature and Kabbalistic analysis in the Zohar, Sefer Yetzirah, and any Kabbalistic text, you will find this figure. And this is the tree of life diagram of the Kabbalah. And the reason I mention is because it's derived from this enlarged hexagram in that cadence, creates that complex figure within which is this array. And these circles are all what are called sfirot. They are nodes, and they are called sfirot. And there are 10 sfirot in this Kabbalistic tree of life, all with names that I'm listing here. And I want you to look at these words. This is the transliteration. Bina, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod. Where have you heard those words just from a few minutes ago? You've heard them in the prayers of Shachrit. These are the Hebrew words for them. You've heard them in the Torah service. You hear them every day when you're praying, twice a day, more than twice a day. You hear them many, many times during the week. These are the words, the code words of the attributes of Hashem. These are considered, and each one is a lecture or actually a course in itself. So here are the terms in the Shachrit prayers: Memshalah, Netzach, Gdula, Gvura, Tiferet, Malchut. All of those words in Yishtabach, or in the Torah service, Gvura, V'hatiferet, V'netzach, V'hahod, and Mamlacha and Rosh are all part of the Sfirot of the Kabbalistic tree of life, the attributes of Hashem. Now you see these, there are actually all these little connections here, all these little lines connecting all these nodes I put in green. If you count them up, guess what? 22 paths. What's also 22? I showed you this in the hidden meanings lecture. If you go back to that talk, you'll find some of the hidden meanings there. It's the number of letters in the Hebrew alphabet. Each path has a letter assigned, and it's there for a reason. And all of that is, again, a very, very complicated discussion. And now what I want to do is introduce the fact that there is actually a hidden sphira. There's actually an 11th sphira, which is called knowledge, and in Hebrew, da'at. Where is it placed? Where do you think it would have been placed? It would have been the seat of knowledge of the creation from the original hexagram here. That's where the word da'at, or knowledge, is placed. And I did it in a dotted line because it's hidden. It's the hidden knowledge of Hashem seated within that hexagram of creation. Here's it in another form. Here are all the different sfirot, and you can see where the Hebrew letters are put in. This is not random. This is done in a very specific way, and the meanings behind this go on and on and on for years. You can discuss these, but these are all talked about in the Zohar and the various Kabbalistic texts. So these are 11 sfirot, and actually there are also 22 paths. And if I just get rid of the temporarily with the da'at, because it's not an official sphira, it's added on and hidden. But among the other 10 sfirot and 22 letters, the Kabbalists call these the 32 divine forces that make up the cosmos. And this comes from the original text, the oldest text we have that show this Kabbalistic tree of life, and it's called the Sefer HaYetzirah, and it's in chapter 1. So here is da'at, and it has connections there. And so now we can answer the third mystery, the paradox in the story of the Garden of Eden, because we don't know which tree is in the middle of Eden, the tree of life or the tree of knowledge. And in Kabbalistic philosophy, we take this figure, remember this is in the middle, this is the central hexagram from which all of these radiated out. That's it here. And I'm going to put in that position a couple of extra little paths just to show you the original hexagram. I can't explain why they've deleted these in the original. I guess they had 22 letters. They couldn't fill all these paths. But if you put these paths back in temporarily, you can see how knowledge is in the middle of this, the knowledge of the creation. So for the Kabbalists, they answer the problem, the paradox. How do you get a tree of knowledge and a tree of life in the same place? There is no conflict. The tree of knowledge is within the tree of life. It's the hidden knowledge that is there within the tree of life. And so for them, there is no conflict in Bereshit. So let's get rid of the unnecessary paths. Here's our original hexagram. And so for the Kabbalists, the tree of knowledge is within the tree of life and represents Hashem. And that is actually verified in Shmuel Aleph, in 1 Samuel, where the words Ki El Deot Hashem, that God is knowledge, that knowledge is that of Hashem. And it's very strategic that when we look at knowledge, what is the closest sphira? The closest sphira to it is wisdom. And now we're going to go off on another tangent. I'm going to show you this, and you can unmute everybody again. Since God is knowledge, I want somebody to tell me where this exists.
In Rome.
Can I say something?
It's
Sure.
the Sistine Chapel.
Sistine Chapel.
So the border of this place is actually the design of the brain. And that's when we say, Shashem bara et ha'adam bechokma.
Ruchama, you are 2 slides ahead of me.
Oh, sorry.
I'm going to tell you my next question was, what is in this picture, in this fresco in the Sistine Chapel?
Exactly.
That has been missed for 380 years.
Yeah, that was Michelangelo who understood this.
Let me go along. What she's saying is, look at the outline. It's been there on that ceiling for all those centuries, and it took a medical student in 1983 to figure out that this is an outline of the brain.
Right.
So look at it very carefully. Look at the outline here. For those of you with medical knowledge, this is the pituitary here, the hypothalamus, pituitary. You have here the pons right there. Here is the fissure right there. Michelangelo and the masters of the Middle Ages knew anatomy absolutely to perfection. And what I'm going to show you, I showed you this book called The Sistine Secrets. There are hundreds, literally hundreds of secrets that he painted into the Sistine Chapel, including 20 body parts hidden within the frescoes of the Sistine Chapel, and many mystical and Kabbalistic implications, as Ruchama was saying, that are in that. And she's exactly right. It's not by chance that he showed the brain here with God creating Adam. It's actually the right side of the brain, which is your creative part of the brain. That's the chokhmah, the wisdom of the brain is in the right hemisphere. And it's not in right-handed people, I'm sorry, in right-handed people. Left-handed people have it the opposite, but Michelangelo went with the majority, and it's the right side of the brain, which is the concealed wisdom. The chokhmah is there beside the chokhmah, the wisdom, the knowledge of creation, of Hashem. Okay, Corey, you got to mute everybody again. We're going to go back here. So, oh, wait a minute. No, you can leave it. No, sorry. unmute it, because we're going to now take another tangent. Here we are, the Kabbalistic tree of life diagram. And as I mentioned, the earliest representation of this is from the Sefer HaYetzirah, and now we're at 250 CE. So the earliest editions that we have date back to the 3rd century CE. There's also the prototype of the actual Bible of the Kabbalistic mysticism is called the Zohar. The Zohar is longer than the Talmud, believe it or not. It's hundreds and hundreds of pages, takes years for people to study this. And the actual book on which most of Kabbalah is based was from Spain, written by, we think it was written by, although he doesn't admit to it, by a scholar by the name of Moses de Leon in Spain. And it's called Sefer HaZohar, and it dates from the late 13th century. So the original concepts of the mysticism from the Sefer Yetzirah are elaborated and fully explained and elaborated in the Zohar. Now we can unmute everybody, because now we're going to go off on another tangent, but this is the last time. We're not going to be coming back this time. We're going off on a totally different direction. And I'm going to ask you to unmute everybody and ask if anybody has seen this figure in any other context. And please, if you have seen my previous presentation, don't give it away to everybody else. And I'm going to give you 3 clues. If nobody comes up with it, I'm going to give you 3 clues. Okay, everybody's unmuted. Here, okay, you can unmute yourself if you know. I'm going to make the first clue is this. Are you ready? I'm putting it this way.
Sideways. Looks like the
Anybody figure out what this actually is?
ark.
Or where they've seen it before. Sorry, where they've seen it before. And I would bet that most of you have seen this but didn't realize it, because our next move is going to give you a whole new perspective on how this is applied. I'm going to make another clue is that it should be at 23 degrees to the horizontal. So it was just a little complicated, but it should be at 23 degrees to the horizontal. Any clues yet?
The Earth,
The last clue is going to give
the
it away.
axis of the Earth is 23 degrees.
That is a good guess. That's not the answer, but that's a good guess.
Well, I didn't say I knew the answer. I can guess.
You can actually, if you remember my Akedah talk, we talked about the variable axis of the Earth, that it wobbles, right? So
Yeah,
23 is the average, but it wobbles from 21 to 24 and back, and that's part of the reason we could contribute to the Akedah. Okay, I'm going to give you the last clue, just so we don't spend all night. Are you ready? Here's the last clue. Da, 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 da.
North, south, east, west.
Where do you see that? Where is that usually a convention of?
North Star.
A compass.
Map.
Very close, a compass. And therefore, where do you
You said
need
it.
Yeah.
this on a paper?
What?
What is this helping you when you see something on paper? What is it?
Orientation.
An orientation for a what?
Direction.
North.
Yes, for
On a map.
Map.
a map.
Point for me.
A map of what?
Earth?
Very specific on Earth.
You say?
Israel.
The temple.
Very good. That's a very common guess that it's a map of Jerusalem. And the answer is no. Jerusalem comes in right at the end, but we're not, it's not Jerusalem. But now we're gonna-
Tabernacle?
Sorry?
The
Oh, Charlie, you were
tabernacle?
there. You were there. Don't give it away.
I wasn't there.
Oh, you weren't there.
Temple.
Good. Okay, go
Temple.
ahead. Yes, go
The
ahead.
temple.
Temple.
Not the temple, not the temple. Okay, but I said almost all of you have seen this.
It
But not-
resembles an old map by the mariners had her in Columbus's time and that kind of thing. It has that kind of spread.
No. It came after Columbus. But let me show you. We're going to take it. Remember, I told you that this was a Kabbalah geometry and modern geography. That's the title. We haven't come to the modern geography yet. So I'm going to ask you to mute yourselves now. Corey, if you're there, if you can mute everybody, because now we're going to take, our Odyssey is going to take us around the world. In 1666 CE, the first stop of the tour is London, England. In 1666, there was a great fire of London that destroyed 90% of the city. And at that time, this was now 6 years after the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell disintegrated in 1660, and King Charles II was restored to the throne. So the monarchy was reestablished. 6 years into his reign, he lost 60% of his capital city. And in that year, here are the protagonists who are part of this story. He had to rebuild the city and asked the greatest architects of his age to come up with a plan to rebuild the city of London. These two gentlemen on the right were two of the architects who came forward. So this is Charles II. This is the painting of him. He commissions these two gentlemen, one by the name of John Evelyn and the other by the name of Christopher Wren. Let me show you the design. Within 2 weeks, they presented their case to Charles II 2 days apart. Here is John Evelyn's design for the new city of London in 1666. Does this look familiar to you? Let me now show you Christopher Wren. Now, Christopher Wren, for those of you that know architecture, is pictured here with St. Paul's Cathedral in the distance. He was a master architect, engineer, and a brilliant scholar. He designed and built St. Paul's Cathedral. He is also one who came with a map, and here is his map for the new city of London. Does that look familiar to you? And in fact, in the documents, people actually put in the nodes at the points that he put in. Let me go back. That's his design, and there are the nodes. Do they look familiar to you? It's the tree of life diagram with the spherot exactly match the design that Christopher Wren had for London in 1666. Now, which design do you think Charles II picked? The answer is this one. And that's the design on which London was rebuilt in the late 1660s. These are the various structures that are located at those nodes. The Templar Church, this is the modern version, but it was an older version. The Royal Exchange, St. Paul's, Grace Church Street, which was originally a fountain where this building is, and Old London Bridge. So you know the old song, London Bridge is falling down. This is a painting of the original London Bridge as it was in the Middle Ages. So from the design, they put these structures at these nodes on the Tree of Life diagram. The Templar Church was the foundation. Now the Templars are going to come into play a little later on, but the Templars' legacy was still present in the 1670s, even though, according to history, the Templar Knights were dissolved by the mid-1300s. Yet their legacy persisted, and that is going to come into play later on when I have another question for you. So here's the Templar Church was at foundation. Beauty, of course, Wren would put his own church there. The cathedral must be a beauty. The Royal Exchange was at the crown because at that time, the merchant class became the strongest class other than the aristocrats in England and in Europe. And so they gave the Royal Exchange at crown, and knowledge was the Grace Church fountain. So you talk about fountain of knowledge, it came from the concepts in the Middle Ages that wisdom and knowledge was coming from, was represented by fountains. And today we don't have a fountain there. London Bridge was where immigrants and new citizens would come into the city of London, and that was put at mercy. You can't identify the tree of life diagram. This is the axis here from the one side to the other. Here's the Templar Church, St. Paul's Cathedral, and it goes on. But you see the city is so complex, things have changed, that even though you can look for it when you visit there the next time, hopefully before too long, when the epidemic is done, you can go back and look for these nodes, but they're going to be hard to find because a lot has changed. But that was the idea over 300 years ago. And notice a 23 degrees of the axis here. Now the second stop on the tour. We're on an Odyssey here, okay? We're now going along the timeline around the same time, 1660. Where do we stop next? Paris, France. What does the name Paris mean? Paris comes from two words, par, Isis, for Isis. Isis was one of the chief gods of the Egyptians. And you'll see why this next design is very, very intimately related to the temples and the design of cities in Egypt. And here are the protagonists on this journey. These are the people involved, and you're going to recognize, many of you will recognize this gentleman down here, former president of France. He was the last who put the last pieces of the puzzle together. So who are all these other people? Well, Louis the 14th, sorry, XIV, I got to look. Louis the 14th was called the Sun King. He reigned for a long period of time. In 1660, he commissioned the greatest landscaper of the time, a man by the name of André Le Nôtre. And if you go to the Tuileries Garden, you'll see plaques dedicated to this man and a corner of the garden dedicated to him. He was the man who designed the Tuileries Garden, and he was also the man who laid the original design for the city of Paris, the new city of Paris. This is the axis here. And these are the sites that are put together in the array according to the tree of life diagram. You have the Tuileries Gardens as they look now, leading to the Louvre Palace. Now the Louvre Palace, the Louvre is a museum, but in those days, in the Middle Ages, it was the seat of the monarchy. That's where the crown was. So you can imagine where they put the Louvre Palace in this design. The Place de Concorde with an obelisk in the middle. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And the Arc de Triomphe, which was commissioned by Napoleon. So André Le Nôtre laid things out according to the axis of the tree of life diagram. Here, the Tuileries Garden that he created, and subsequent to that, they built the Champs-Élysées. So here are this is the Louvre Palace, is at the crown. And here come two more protagonists in this design. The man on the left is Napoleon Bonaparte. And the man on the right is a man that you should all read up about. His name is Jean-Francois Champollion. Does that name sound familiar to anybody? Anybody with any knowledge of history, linguistics, archaeology, Egyptology?
Rosetta Stone.
Absolutely, the Rosetta Stone. He didn't live very long, but he did a lot in his life. He was a historian and linguist and a professor of history in Grenoble, France. In 1822, he deciphered a stone that was found in Egypt, written by a decree by Ptolemy V in Memphis, that Napoleon's army had found, and Napoleon commissioned Champollion to try and figure out how, well, at least he eventually tried to figure out how to decipher these. And luckily, this stone has three languages: hieroglyphics, Demotic Egyptian, and ancient Greek. And it was thanks to this ancient Greek translation that the whole science of hieroglyphics and Egyptology arose, thanks to this man. But he had another, he was also a brilliant engineer and did something that had not been done in several millennia. And that's this obelisk here. So here's this obelisk in the Place de Concorde. And that was placed at the position of beauty. And the Arc de Triomphe by Napoleon was put at the point of foundation. So the Place de Concorde had a fountain originally, which was eventually changed to an obelisk. And that's what is in this position here. Now, subsequent to that, now you'll see here that the design of Paris took over 300 years to finish. This man, Francois Mitterrand, commissioned the creation of the Grande Arche de la Défense, which is a modern structure. And it was created and finished in 1989, as was this structure, a pyramid by the very famous architect I.M. Pei. And this is right in front of the Louvre Palace. And so in the modern times, the Grand Arch at Kingdom and the pyramid, again, the pyramid of knowledge. Now, if you look at this axis down the middle, again, in Paris, it's at 23 degrees. Now, why 23 degrees? The reason is because this design for Paris has a counterpart somewhere else in the world. And that is Heliopolis or Luxor in Egypt. Now, I've had to turn the diagram horizontally. It's actually pointing north this way. But there are, in this axis, in Luxor, if you're ever visiting, if you ever went down to Luxor, you'll find temples, pyramids, and obelisks in this array. And it turns out that the array of these structures in Luxor are exactly the same ratio of the distances of the structures in the axis of Paris. So not only was the design mimicking this design in Egypt from 1300 and earlier BCE, it was actually in the same ratios that they were put of these structures. Again, in Luxor, because of the Nile River, the structures are actually at an angle of 23 degrees. That's the reason why in London and Paris, the axes of these designs are at 23 degrees. This area, this path from the one temple, the Luxor temple, to the Karnak temple, is lined by a bunch of stone sphinxes called the dromos. So that's down the axis from one temple to the other. Here are the structures. The Luxor temple complex, it's the entire complex, is reproduced to scale in the axis of the structures in Paris on purpose. From north to south, there's the Karnak temple here, the Luxor dromos, all these that line the strip there between the two temples. The obelisk of Hatshepsut and the Luxor temple are in this array down the middle there, and there's where they are. Those are the structures from north to south with the dromos, exactly matched in their ratios of distances of the structures of the new design of Paris, and which was kept up by all these descendants of all these people through to Francois Mitterrand, who commissioned there to put the Grand Arch right there, so at beyond the Arc de Triomphe. So these structures here, these four structures, these main structures, are reproductions of the Luxor design. Now, I want to show you something else. I said that right here is an obelisk. Napoleon wasn't happy just to have something dedicated there in like a fountain in that position. He had a much grander plan. He wanted to not only have the same design as the Luxor temples, he wanted to have something from Egypt, from those temples in that place. This came from this temple here, this temple of Luxor. You see there, that missing pedestal there? That obelisk that was here in ancient Egypt is now in the Place de Concorde in Paris. Somebody had to figure out how to take this 500-ton, this is the other one, there were two here at one time. Somebody had to figure out how to take a 500-ton structure, take it down without breaking it, and transport it an enormous distance to here. It had to get from Middle Egypt, across the Mediterranean, across water, swamps, different countries, and land to Paris, and somehow take it down and put it back up. The genius who figured that out, for the first time since ancient Egypt, when these structures were built, was the same guy, Champollion. He was the guy who figured out how to get the obelisk from the Luxor temples to Paris to satisfy Napoleon's wishes. And that's why there is the obelisk in the middle of the Place de Concorde, because Champollion figured out the engineering to get it from one place to the other. First time that anything of that weight had ever been transported since the time that those temples were built. And now we have the axis here of Paris, and there we have the Place de Concorde, just an interesting part of history. Our Odyssey continues. Third stop on the tour. And now we can get our American friends in here. Your capital city in 1790 was also part of these designs. So in 1790, people that you all my American friends and maybe some Canadian friends here will also recognize maybe 3 of these people who were heavily involved in the design of a new capital city for the new republic, the young republic of the United States of America. This is Washington himself. He set out the plans, and what he did was that he sent Thomas Jefferson on the left and Benjamin Franklin to France to talk to the descendants of André Le Nôtre, not the descendants genetically, but from the schools, the artists, the architects, the engineers, from the time of Le Nôtre, from his school, the people that were now in power there in Paris. One of them, the head of that consortium, was a man by the name of Pierre L'Enfant. This is him, Pierre L'Enfant. So if you haven't recognized him, this is who he is. Here is L'Enfant's design that he gave Franklin and Jefferson to take back to George Washington in 1790. And we're going to turn it, it's facing east, on its edge, and tell me what that is representing there. If you follow, all of the nodes and the sephirot of the Tree of Life diagram are in this. Here are nodes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and here are all the interconnecting paths. And here are the structures that are in the array according to this Kabbalistic Tree of Life diagram. The US Capitol, which is of course at the crown. The White House. The Washington Monument is matching the obelisk that is in the Place de Concorde. It's going to be in the same position. The Smithsonian Institutions. This is the original building from 1847 and is now the administrative center of the Smithsonian Institutions. So at the time, early on, this is where these structures were allocated. Here is the mall. And many of you, I'm sure everybody who's visited Washington has walked down there not realizing that you are walking down the core of a Tree of Life diagram, the Tree of Life plan. Now, originally the Capitol building, in front of it was a statue, when it was built, a statue of George Washington in the guise of the god Zeus. That statue is no longer there. I believe it's near the Smithsonian or somewhere else in Washington, but he was given that crown. But of course, there was no monarchy. The United States was built as a republic, not as a monarchy, but he was given the guise as sort of a quasi-king in the statue, but eventually that statue was removed. But it was here at the Capitol, at the crown. The Washington Monument, at the same place that the monument that Champollion put in Paris. At the Washington Monument is at Beauty. The Smithsonian is at the seat of knowledge along the mall. The White House is at the position of Gevurah. And here are 3 other structures that were built subsequent to that. the Lincoln Memorial, completed in the 1920s, the Jefferson Memorial in the 1940s, and the World Bank building. And they are placed, Lincoln Memorial at foundation, the World Bank at glory, and the Jefferson Memorial eventually at victory, opened in 1947, which is why, again, the design was not completed for many, many years. It took many years to reach this. This is the Lincoln Memorial, and I'm going to show you just another little point that is very interesting. It was designed by a sculptor. It was sculpted by a man by the name of Daniel Chester French. Daniel French's son was deaf. His son went to a university, the all-deaf university in Washington, D.C., called Gallaudet University. The person who gave the charter to open the university was Abraham Lincoln. And what French did as a tribute to Lincoln is to make his two hands the sign language letters for A and L. So Abraham Lincoln's statue, again, next time you go, look carefully at his hands. The letters A and L are embedded there by Chester French as a tribute to the fact that his son was able to study at a university chartered by Abraham Lincoln himself. So there's the axis. And now we've come to our final step. There's one more city on the tour that wasn't in my original presentation because I didn't know that it had a design according to this template. We come now to just a century ago, 1911, New Delhi, India. In 1911, the government seating there under British mandate set out to develop a new capital city. The city is no longer called New Delhi, it's just called Delhi, but at that time it was a new district, a totally new area, and these are the protagonists for this part. On the left is a very famous architect from England, probably the foremost architect and one of the greatest architects of all time by the name of Edwin Lutyens. And he commissioned a father and nephew, one gentleman, and I don't have a picture of the nephew, but this is the senior Singh, but they were the foremost architects of the time. And here is Lutyens' design of the new city of Delhi. And if you look very carefully, you can see all of the nodes, just like in the Washington design, all of the Kabbalistic tree of life connections are all there. And when you look at that and have all of these different structures, now I don't have any sorts that these were intentionally put at these places, but there are all these structures at the various nodes on this diagram. And I'll just show you all these different modern buildings now. And they are seated here at these various nodes. The main thoroughfare down the middle is called Rajpath Road, and it connects a structure called the India Gate, which was a tribute to the Indian fighters who fought on the side of the British in the First World War. But in these places, you can see the India Gate. There's a fountain at the Place of Beauty. The presidential palace is at foundation, and these various other structures are gradually were built up over a number of decades, and these are where they're located. So they are located strategically at these nodes. Whether they have that significance at those particular nodes, I don't know, but it does fill the design that we saw in all of these cities. And that's our Odyssey. So I'm going to summarize. We started off developing the Ma'aseh Bereshit as a Kabbalistic hexagram, the hexagram of creation with the seed of knowledge of Hashem, who designed this and brought this into being, built according to the cadence of creation, which now we know of as the diatonic major scale, creates this figure within which is this figure here, which is the tree of life diagram, with its nodes, which are the Sfirot, and the hidden one in the middle, knowledge within the original hexagram with the Chokhmah, the seed of wisdom, Hashem Ba'al Deot. And then from the original prototype that we probably was given to Moses on Mount Sinai, the design from which all of these came about, but also are paradigms that exist in other places. And when Paris was designed, they used this design of Luxor and Heliopolis, which happens to also be along the nodes of the Tree of Life diagram. And from the Sefer Yetzirah, which was the original book on which this diagram came, we have a design that has been the template for some of the great cities of the world, the modern geography, which still exists today, and which, when you go to visit again, will hopefully have a very different meaning for you when you go and see the design of these cities. From Christopher Wren's London design, 1666, to the design of Paris, Le Notre and all his followers, and Champollion and Mitterrand and everybody for the design of Paris. L'Enfant's design for Washington, which took almost, many, many decades for it to find its final manifestation. And finally, New Delhi, designed by Lutyens. 1939 was when this was completed. And so that's the design as we see it today. This design derived from Maaseh Bereshit that has been a paradigm passed on for centuries now, that is now being applied in modern geography. And now we want to open up we can open up now for the end here. We can open up everybody's mute. I'm going to give you the last mystery, the last part of the puzzle, and that is all of these characters. Everybody I've mentioned in all of these different designs, through all these ages, over 300, 400 years, they all have something in common. Any guesses?
Knights of the Templar.
You're close.
We're all dead.
We're all Masons.
They are all Freemasons. Now, I'm going to show you something even more remarkable. The most ancient rite of Freemasonry, the one that is the original, historically original from the early Middle Ages, is the Scottish Rite. It is the most developed and the one that is hardest to progress in. In fact, I remember a member at Beth David, one of our former members, our late member Harold Cohen, was a Freemason. Jews were allowed to be Freemasons, but they could not rise to beyond the 3rd degree. The highest honors within the Scottish Rite are the 31st through 33rd degrees. My question is, why? This goes back to the Templar Knights. The Templar Knights were the guardians of the Pope's troops and the Crusades going to the Holy Land. But it's thought in ancient times, back in the early Middle Ages, that they had another purpose. And when they actually took over, the Templars were named Templars because they took over the Temple Mount. And they were one of the many groups that have been searching for the temple treasures. And it's thought that this may be some of the legacy. We said that the Templar Church is the foundation in the London design 300 years after the Templars were supposed to have disappeared. But the Scottish Rite, which was a subsequent entity of Freemasons, their highest level are the 31st to 33rd degrees, which just happen to be the latitudes within which exist the land of Israel. The middle one, 32 degrees, is the latitude of Yerushalayim. And who were on the Temple Mount prior to that, looking for the temple treasures, were the Knights Templar. So I just give you these temptations. The books that I gave you, the references that I gave you early on, go into this in exquisite detail as to the coincidences or non-coincidences of all of this. So the highest rites in the Scottish rites were 31 to 33. Question is why? Anyhow, just something to think about. So what sciences did we utilize today? I told you this was going to be a broad scope. We had to use all of these different areas of science and history and so on in order to understand, to get from Bermuda-Bereshit to modern geography. Through Michelangelo, through mysteries of Kabbalah, through modern geography and brilliance of architects and engineers, most of whom were Freemasons. So we've come to the end of my 8 talks. And as I say, eventually this one, if you want to hear it again, it'll be accessed through this portals. There'll be YouTube, put in Beth David Ben Israel Beth Am. You'll see the first icon is 102 videos, or 103 by now. When you click on it, you'll see that at the just above that, there are some titles. One is playlists. If you click that, you'll see the folder with all my talks. If this is the first one you've heard and you're interested in the others, I hope you'll enjoy them as well. And this one will be posted within a few days if you want to go back and if you want to find the references. And we've reached the end of our Odyssey, legacy for all of us to enjoy from the earliest times and earliest biblical times. And if I give this talk again, I'll be updating it. Of course, at least the year will have to be updated, of course. But I hope that this is something that's been provocative, enjoyable, and enlightening for all of you. And wish you all stay healthy. And the vaccines are coming. And I hope that we'll be able to have talks that we can give in person, because I really enjoy the interaction in person much more than I do on this medium. So I know it's a bit late, but I'm happy to take any questions, and I hope you found this stimulating.
I have a question.